Hello, and we're talking today in chapter 14 about world orders. And so, this part of the book, the last chapters, we're going to be focusing more on political geography. So, more of the political arrangement of people. And so, we've talked a little bit about how society begins as hunter gatherers, and this was based on the family, and eventually grew into societies that were based on farming. But the countries that we know today, the world order that we know today, starts from that. So that's what we're going to explore if I can get my cursor to work. So we're going to go back about maybe, 6,000 years to Uruk, which is currently looks like this. And may not look like much, but if you could travel back in time, if you could get in your TARDIS and go back, let's see, about 4,000 years ago, it looked roughly like this. Now please know this is a recreation. I actually couldn't go back in time. Because if I could go back in time, I wouldn't be teaching this for a living, right? This is what we think Uruk looked like. And that building in the middle right there is what this is today. So Uruk. Uruk was one of the first empires that we know of, right? And so it begins as this large city in what is today Iraq. So this area right here, this is currently Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Palestine, Israel, so on and so forth. This area that's green has always been a relatively fertile place to grow crops, and some of the earliest cities begin here, in what we call Mesopotamia. Okay, now Uruk is located right there, and it becomes one of the largest cities of its time, and eventually grows. It was located in this fertile area on the Euphrates River, and if you go back 4,000 years ago, the Persian Gulf was much deeper, and it was actually on the coast. So it was in the middle of a fertile area on a big river on a coast. It allowed it to trade, and it grew very powerful, and it began to basically conquer its neighboring cities. And so this is the beginning of the Uruk Empire. And it goes through this pattern of rise and fall that all empires really have since then. So an empire begins to grow by conquering territory. It takes over other territories. And that was 2000 BC. By the year 500 BC, empires had grown larger. This is the Persian Empire, whereas Uruk just controlled this little area here. The Persian Empire controlled much of what we now call the Middle East. And empires grow. As they grow, they incorporate other areas. All these areas become part of the Persian Empire. And sometimes the effects of that linger long past the empire. Empires can grow larger and larger throughout history because of better technology. The reason that the Persian Empire was able to be so much larger than the Uruk Empire, remember Ur was just right here, and Persia is much bigger, is one, they built better roads, so they could move their military farther and faster. They had wheeled chariots, so they had a better technological system. With better transportation and better technology, the Persian Empire, which is based right here, was able to project its power to all these areas. Later on, we'll see empires like the British Empire, which controlled 20% of the world, but they also had steamships, railroads, and airplanes. Eventually, all empires fall, and usually what happens is distance decay. An empire grows too big, and it is just not able to control its periphery. So the reason that the Persian Empire only gets this large is they get over here to Greece, and the city-states of ancient Greece, the Athens, the Spartans, were able to resist them because they were so far from their center of power they could not project as much power as they want. Distance decay. The further from your center of power, the weaker your reach. So, these early empires, which began about 2,000 years ago up until the 1900s, began the expansion of global integration. So here's what I mean. This is the British Empire in 1900. And you can't see under this map here, but this is Australia, and parts of Indonesia were also part of the British Empire. Now the British Empire by the 1960s was mostly gone. Okay? But this map shows you countries where English is either the official language, dark blue, or it is an unofficial or second language. And you can see that it's very similar to the map of the British Empire. So why would Sudan or India or all these other countries have English as a second language? Well, when they were part of the British Empire, Britain was their controlling emperor. So if you wanted to have a job in government or wanted to work with the elite, like we talked about with language, you learned English. And the side effect was many people learned English as a second language. Why it's been beneficial, as we talked about, in the case of India, there are many languages in India. But if everyone has a common second language, it makes communication much clearer. But what this just shows you is the more recent the empire, the British Empire breaks up basically in the 1950s. So there's still a lot of after effects. The Persian Empire breaks up 2,000 years ago. So its effects are far less widely felt. So what are some of the elements we're going to talk about geographically? Global integration, moving the world into one larger network, imperial overstretch, and imperial disintegration. So global integration. And this really takes off in what we call the early modernity period of 1400. And this is when we connected the old world and the new world, right? Spanish colonization of North and South America, and for the first time, all the continents of the world are engaged and integrated. And that begins in 1400. Okay? So these empires facilitated the movement of knowledge, people, practices. It explains why all the areas here in orange, which were once part of the Spanish Empire, still speak Spanish as the majority language. And even in the United States, even though English is the official, well, unofficial, official language, in large areas of California, New Mexico, and Texas, there are people who were there living there before it was part of the United States and speak Spanish as their first language. I think a more interesting example is baseball. So if you look at this map, this shows Major League Baseball players in the last several years. Which countries do they come from if they're not American? And you can see by far the most come from the Dominican Republic, which is half of a small island in the Caribbean, as well as Cuba, right, Puerto Rico, and Venezuela. Why so many baseball players in these countries where baseball is not the most popular sport? It is popular, but not the most popular. Well, this map shows you that at certain points in the last 100 years, we've had a lot of military interventions. Here is the Dominican Republic, right? We had troops there on the ground for about 30 years, basically running the country. It was a colony and everything but name. And those baseball troops on their weekends off would get together and play baseball and taught the local kids to play it. Same thing in Venezuela, in Haiti, in Cuba especially, and in Mexico. So baseball is actually a byproduct of the American spread of military force. One of the most popular sports in the world is cricket. And if you haven't seen cricket, it comes from the United Kingdom. It's a British sport. Some say it is the ancestor of baseball. It is also one of the most popular sports in India and Pakistan. And again, not a Pakistan or Indian sport, but because they were part of the British Empire, children learned to play it. So what is one of the causes? What pushed these empires to grow? And it was driven largely for the desire for money. So in the 13 or 1400s, spices, gold, these things that drove the economy largely came from what we call the Far East, so India and China and Indonesia. Pepper as a spice in the 1300s was almost as much money per ounce as gold. And this shows you the main trade routes. Traders would send ships through the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf. But in 1450, the Turkish Empire conquers this area right here and cuts into the trade. They stop the traders from Europe going through, and they tax them and stop their trading. Now there's this roadblock, but there's still this demand for goods. And so this leads to the Portuguese trying to sail around Africa and the Spanish sailing to the Americas. Remember, Columbus thought he was going to sail all the way across the globe, right, and come over here to China. These were originally spurred to get around the Turks and get to those goods of empire. But that led to the Spanish Empire and the European colonization of Asia. This also leads to the beginning of the core periphery structure we talked about, right? This model of the core imperial powers taking from their colonies the periphery, the labor, the raw materials, and selling them back. So that begins in this model. And it's been kept for many, many years afterwards. We've replaced colonial corism with economic corism. Okay, and it still leads to the unequal exchange, where the core still takes more from the periphery economically than it gives back. And so if we look today at the core, right, Western Europe is still a center of this. We are still a center of this. And increasingly, over here in Asia, this is a growing part of the core too. Okay. So we're going to pause the lecture here. Time for you to get up, stretch, shake a little bit, have a cup of coffee, and we'll be back with part 2 in just a moment.